Chicken Run 2 Dawn of the Nugget was released in 2023 and was directed by Sam Fell. It tells the story of the chickens who are happily living life in their new island, and Rocky and Ginger have a kid named Molly who wants to go on an adventure outside the island. When she escapes, she gets kidnapped, which leads her into the hands of Mrs. Tweedy. So it's up to Rocky, Ginger, and the other chickens to team up to save her.
I'm just gonna say it. The first Chicken Run is peak. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, this has always been one of my favourite movies of all time. I'm a huge fan of the first Chicken Run. It's got such a great story, so engaging, great animation, great characters, great villains, great music, and just overall, brilliant film. So I still remember when I heard there was going to be a sequel back in 2018, and I said to myself, that's quite surprising. I think it's no lie to say that everyone was surprised when it was announced that Chicken Run would be getting a sequel when it was announced back in 2018, 18 years after the first film, and now it's finally here after 23 years after the first movie. So 2 decades and a quarter? Well, that'd probably be 25 years if it was 2 decades and a quarter, but you get my point. So it's been a long time since the original film, and it still holds up, I believe. It's a great movie. So I seen the trailers for Dawn of the Nugget recently, and I said to myself, it looks like a good sequel. I didn't see it any chance topping the original. I didn't see any way in hell they were going to beat this film, and it definitely doesn't. But I thought the trailers looked pretty good, and after watching the sequel, I can definitely say it's a pretty good film and a very decent sequel. But not on the same level as the first one. But that's not to say the film's a step down. It's just, this film is just so damn good. I feel it's quite impossible to live up to it personally. And yeah, that's why I think the second film is just nowhere near as good as the first movie. But still, let's talk about it. So the storyline. It's good. Now, the storyline definitely has flaws, I think. I think the storyline for this one is very cliche. You have the cliche with Rocky and Ginger's daughter, Molly, wanting to go outside the island. She wants to see more of the world. And then she gets kidnapped, and she has to listen to her parents. Then they learn that that's wrong. And it's very cliche. And while the execution is still good enough, it's too simple. It's too easy to know what's going to happen. And there's not a lot of twists and turns, which unfortunately do hurt the story a little bit. So the storyline is just, it's predictable. It doesn't quite have that same energy, that same execution that the first movie had. Because while the first movie did tell a cliche stories with chickens trying to escape the farm, it was just executed in such a creative, funny, engaging, and kind of dark way. But the sequel just doesn't have the same energy. It doesn't have that same intelligence that the first film has. But it's still a good story because there is still a lot of heart, and the jokes are genuinely quite funny. Some of the jokes are actually even funnier than some of the ones in the first film. However, there's just times where the storyline, it's just, I was just kind of saying to myself when I was watching the film, this is definitely not as good as the first film. Just nowhere near that same level. And there are also times where the sequel tends to rehash the first film. Because you have the chickens getting kidnapped again in the factory. It's just, I'm just saying to myself, this is so much like the first movie. And it felt the exact same. It kind of felt copied and pasted to me personally. And I actually do think a lot of it does come down to the fact that they brought back Mrs. Tweedy, who personally, I don't think Mrs. Tweedy should have been in this film. I'll get to her character later. But yeah, I did feel at times the storyline was really rehashing the first film, and there's so many plot elements and so many scenes in this film that just feel the exact same as the first movie. But even with the flaws, I still think the storyline is still pretty good. It still has its heart in the right place, and it still has its humour and charm. It's just nowhere near as intelligent, as smart as the first movie. So the first film definitely has a much better story, but even then, the sequel is still good, and the world building is also very nice too. I love seeing the island that the chickens live on now. It's such nice and creative world building, and such a nice transition from the first film. The animation, oh my god. Now the first movie came out 23 years ago, back in, I think, the summer of 2000? Well, it definitely came out in the year of 2000. But the animation here still looks great. And here it looks much better. It's much more clearer, it's much more crisp. It's so detailed. Like, even when you watch it on Netflix in high definition, the animation is just so colorful, it's so bright. It's beautiful film to look at, and the movements are great, the designs are great, the locations are great. Visually, this is a gorgeous looking film, and Aardman should be very proud of the amount of effort that they put in for the visuals of the film. Visually, this movie looks fantastic. One thing that I feel is quite interesting has to be the voice acting. Now, some of the voice actors from the original didn't come back, so they actually did get a few replacements. And not gonna lie, they're not bad. The voice acting here is still pretty good. Sure, some of the voices would sound a little jarring if you were watching the two movies together, but for what it is, the voice acting is still pretty good. I actually do think everyone did a good job playing their characters, especially Zachary Level as Rocky. He actually did a pretty decent job. And the characters are still pretty good.
Rocky and Ginger still have a very nice dynamic and they play off each other very well as parents. Granted, their dynamic here is not as good as it was in the original film, as the execution of that was just so classic. But here, it's still pretty decent, and in the sequel, they do play off each other quite well still. The new character Molly is pretty good too. I do feel her character arc is very cliche, but I did like how her character is written, and there is some very nice bonding moments between Molly and her parents. And the new addition of characters such as Frizzle are pretty good too. The other chickens such as Babs, Fowler, Bunty are still very good, and still have the same charm and wit that they have in the original film. Nick and Fetcher sadly don't get as much to do here as they do in the first film, but whenever they're on screen, they might actually be even funnier than they were in the first film. The main villain, Mrs. Tweedy, however, sadly has to be the weakest character in the entire film. In the original, she was a great antagonist who had quite a brutal death if you ask me, but in here, she's just not all that good. She's just the exact same as she is in the original, but nowhere near as interesting, or as intimidating, or even as iconic as she was before. It just feels like you're rehashing the original with bringing her back, and she's just nowhere near as good as she was before. I mean, why not bring back Mr. Tweedy? Oh yeah, well you can't really, because pretty much when you think about it, he was the one responsible for his wife's death in the first film. But still, I just think bringing back Mr. Tweedy could have been a bit more interesting.
I definitely think Mrs. Tweedy has to be the weakest character in the film. But for the most part, the characters are still pretty likeable and very enjoyable to watch in the film. The music of the film is pretty good too. There's a few songs, yeah, that are kind of forgettable, and I guess the music just isn't quite as good as the first movie soundtrack, but it's still a pretty good music score. So, Chicken Run 2 Dawn of the Nugget is nowhere near as good as the first film in my book, but it's still pretty good.
Overall, Chicken Run 2 is a pretty good sequel. The story definitely has flaws, but it's still a decent continuation, beautiful animation, good characters, and some pretty good music. It may not be quite on the same level as the original, but as a sequel, it's pretty decent and still a pretty good film. I'm going to give Chicken Run 2 Dawn of the Nugget a 7 out of 10.
I definitely think I'm going to like the movie the more I watch it, but I just think the problem for me was just the first film is so good in my book, and it's just with this kind of film, it's so hard to top. Kind of how I feel about Shrek 2. Shrek 2 in the Shrek franchise is a film that I just think is amazing, and I just think it's impossible to live up to it. And while Puss in Boots 2 is slightly below it, I don't quite think Puss in Boots 2 is as good as Shrek 2. So Chicken Run 2, sure, it does pale in comparison to the first film for me, but it's still a good sequel and still a nice transition from the first film. That's it for my review of Chicken Run 2. Stay tuned for my next video, and until then guys, take care everyone. Thank you guys so much for watching. What do you guys think of the Chicken Run movies? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Until then, take care and skidoosh.